That's it. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another Sales Hacker webinar. I'm really excited you could join us today. We still have some people rolling in, so I'm just going to ramble for a second. No, I'm just kidding. All right. Today we're talking about sales development operations. So you know what you signed up for, but think of it as like a potpourri of anything that you can pick up in an hour, quick little tips and tricks that have to do with sales development operations. So we're going to talk about like account territory selection and design, maybe a little compensation incentive stuff, maybe a little bit of automation and workflows, some leadership things. And to help us do all of that, we actually have the perfect person. It's Taft Love. So Taft, welcome and thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. So Taft is a friend. We've done one webinar before. We talked a little bit about the difference between RevOps and Sales Ops. And so Taft is, again, like the perfect person for this because he's not only the VP of sales at DocSend, he also is the head of operations at Iceberg RevOps, which I have trouble describing what that is, Taft. So can you, what is Iceberg RevOps?
Yeah, absolutely. So Iceberg RevOps is a company I started with a friend a couple years back now that has sort of grown, and we do fractional revenue operations for a company. So you get a fractional access to a highly skilled, dedicated operations team, and it's perfect for companies between usually like your first 2 or 3 reps up to 30 or 40 reps when it's time to bring on an in-house, expensive, highly trained RevOps team. So we're how smaller companies access the talent necessary to scale to the next level.
Rather than bringing on somebody who's too expensive for where they are, or trying to reinvent the wheel themselves when they don't necessarily have somebody with the skill set.
Yeah, what we see all the time is people say, well, we need someone to do operations, and James finished Salesforce training, so he should run operations. And the worst problem with that is you don't realize the mistake you've made until 6-12 months down the line when everything's broken and you're trying to fix it. And so some companies come to us then, and we're now finding a lot of companies come to us right as they're getting their 3rd, 4th sales rep and want to get ahead of the curve.
Yeah, okay, so that's perfect because that's what today is about. That's what this webinar is about. We got some questions ahead of time. We baked them into our plan with the things that you and I are going to talk through. But we got, I think, over 650 people signed up for this webinar. So if you haven't already asked me a question via LinkedIn beforehand and you're here joining the live version, please participate. Like if you have questions, we can workshop stuff. If you have a question about what Taft's telling you, or just like plain old disagree, that's fine. Let's make this a conversation. So do me a favor. John Gomez is on top of it. Go in the chat at the bottom of the screen and then see that little blue thing where it says 2. Make sure the 2 is all panelists and attendees. That way you guys can see what each other are asking us. You can talk to each other. Like that's it for everybody, all right? Open the chat, introduce yourselves. Let us know who's here so we can try to tailor our conversation to you guys. While you're introducing yourselves, I'm also just going to quickly mention that we're recording this. So if you have to step away or you just think this is awesome and you want to share it with your team, you'll get the recording tomorrow at the latest. Joe Latchaw's here. Hey again, Joe. John Gomez is in Boston. Me too, Joe. John. James Marlowe from London. Michael, that's a great question. I'm going to hold on to that. We'll get to that. Belgrade, Serbia. Hey, Milovan.
Oh, cool.
Silicon Valley, Atlanta. This is the brilliant thing about, like, this is what my favorite thing, quick aside about Sales Hacker webinars is it's not just some person with a deck, like, talking. This is like a working group that we have twice a week where we cover all kinds of different topics with a variety of opinions. So this is what makes it brilliant. You guys never let me down, but do make sure you ask some good questions. I'll make sure we get to them. NYC, San Francisco, Mexico City.
I love this format too. The conversational format's so much better, like you said, than the deck, because, I mean, my agenda is way less important than what people want to get out of this.
Yeah, that's it. So today we're talking, I was joking with Taft before we started that this reminds me of Jurassic Park when Jeff Goldblum says to the scientists, you scientists were so busy trying to find out if you could, you didn't stop to think if you should. So today we're going to stop and think if we should. We're going to like question some of the commonly accepted beliefs about sales development operations. And I guess to start off, Taft, can you just tell us why we're here doing that today and why that's important?
Yeah, when we started talking about topics, this one jumped to the top of my mind because, first of all, it is the most common question I get, or it's the most common type of question I get about sales development ops, either through Iceberg or just through my network, people asking questions. And I have some theories here, but I think it's pretty simple. There's a proliferation of tools. Lots of companies are waking up to the power of sales development as a means of building pipeline. Now that it's becoming something that more and more companies do, it's also growing as a challenge across not just startups but companies in general. And they're, unlike with sales operations where there are some pretty solid best practices that you can go to, that doesn't exist yet for sales development.
Yeah.
Everyone seems to be reinventing the wheel.
Yeah. And so like, again, you get into a lot of different orgs and you see all of those differences. So that's why I think you're perfect for this. And what we prepared was like a bunch of different topics to hit on. So I think what we're going to do today, gang, is we're going to talk about some of the common challenges, some of the common mistakes, and like fixes for all of those things. So we're going to cover a bunch of topics. We're going to try to move fast, but if you have questions, please throw them out and we'll get to answer. So what I want to start with, Taft, is like one thing that popped up in our earlier conversations was account selection. And like, you know, what role does operations play in that for SD? I think like there are two common ways of going about that you told me about, but maybe you can tell a quick story about how that should work and mistakes there.
Yeah, and funny enough, I saw somebody pop up in the participants for whom this is going to resonate because I'm talking about his company. I'm not going to say the name. A client I've worked with ran into this problem, and while this client is the one I'm thinking of, basically everyone has a similar problem. So basically, the VP of Sales said, "All right, AEs, pick a list of target accounts for your sales development reps to go after." And what almost always happens is the AEs are not particularly thoughtful about which accounts they send to their SDRs. They run a report on, you know, the accounts in their territory and hand the report to their SDR, and they say, "Here you go," as if the SDR didn't already know what territory they were in. And I think this happens because AEs don't have, while they have a strong incentive to work closely with SDRs and help prioritize, the payoff for that work is so far down the line that they prioritize the deals that they're working to close today. You know, inbound, the higher intent pipeline, they prioritize that. And so this is one we see constantly, and there are really two major issues with this. The first is the one I just mentioned. The payoff is way down the line. And the second one is this strategy, if you can call it that. It's really like a single tactic, but it's thought of as a strategy for people who haven't done this before and don't know the pitfalls yet. Is it ignores a lot of the really important things, like what is the SDR's capacity? What are your conversion rates? What capacity do you need in order to hit your goals? And all of these questions that are sort of ignored when you say like, AEs, go choose for your SDRs and you two go figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, basically what's happening there is like, and again, common problem, sales leadership hasn't taken the time to try to like bottom this whole thing out. So they basically say, AEs, you can do this, right? And the AEs go, SDR, you can do this, right? So then you've got probably like the most junior person in the sales org, maybe in the whole company, trying to figure out like the go-to-market priorities. And like if you're an SDR, like you can't be blamed for not knowing or kind of just guessing. You're either going to do some kind of scattershot thing, maybe you'll try to take some strategy to it, and maybe you're really smart about it. But even if you are, there are probably 10 other SDRs or 20 or 30 other SDRs who are doing different things. And at the end, you've got like no idea if your go-to-market is working because you don't have any standardization across the approach, right? So
Yeah.
let's back out of that then. So that's a common problem. I mean, how do we avoid it? Maybe it feels simple now, but like, what's the fix?
So basically, you have three paths you can take here. The one is the one I've already mentioned. Have the AEs choose your accounts. The next, also common, is truly and fully outsourcing your go-to-market strategy. the way you the way you said, handing your go-to-market strategy to the most junior team in the company, which happens all the time. Companies say like, SDRs, go do outbound, and like, let us know who you chose to go after.
Yeah.
And the third, and by the way, these aren't all mutually exclusive. You can have combinations of these, but the one I think companies should do is go to market. The high level strategy should belong to the executive team. Executive team and operations team should work together to decide what is our large target, what is the profile of the type of company we want to aim, at which we want to aim the cannon. And
Yeah.
so for me, that's step one. And from there, where you go next is less important. But that's where it has to start. Otherwise, you're going to have, as you said, 30 SDRs, probably with 15 to 30 different strategies, all going after the world of total accounts out there, instead of taking a focused approach to a subset of your total addressable market.
Yeah, and it's easier to use an eraser on the drafting board than a sledgehammer on the job site, right? So like, it just makes sense to put in the work up front. But here's a question. So when you said sales leadership and operations should work together to decide what that strategy is, like what's the focused list, what are the priorities? In that process of deciding, what do you think the role of ops should be? Is it just like, once we know, build the list? Like you ops guys go pull the list out and make it neat and tidy, or like, what's the role strategically?
So this is something that's different for every company, obviously, and it depends on the seniority of your ops team. If you have a senior ops team with analysts and somebody running the team who has a lot of experience with this, you may be able to hand the bulk of it to them. But for most companies, I think the best way to go about this is for the executive team to come up with a list of questions that will help guide them. So one question might be, hey, historically, where have we been the most successful? Ops team, come back to me with the data sliced in these several ways. I want to see by industry. I want to see by company size, by revenue, by whatever you think might be the best way to slice the data. But come up with questions that your ops team can answer, and therefore inform either the next set of questions or a decision.
Yeah. And like something that can happen there, we're going to talk about this later. I don't want to spoil it, but like you might have a sales leader go, get me the list of all organizations from 1 to 200 employees in, I don't know, where does Farzana live? In Halifax, Nova Scotia. And the sales ops guy goes, or gal goes, oh, I can do that. And they go get the list and they give it to them, when maybe their role should be, asking, why do you want that, or something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you're absolutely right that the answer shouldn't always be okay. The ops role is to use their expertise to guide the rest of the company to decisions. While the ultimate decision may belong to the executive team, it's the ops team's job to make sure that they're asking the right questions, that you're not just blindly following what the less informed team, because the exec team might all be the bosses, but when it comes to operations, hopefully they're the less informed team on operations.
Yeah. All right. So now it's time for Michael. I'm sorry, Michael. I can't say your last name. It's a good one though, and a really good question. So why are sales leaders generally so ignorant about operations? Michael says they don't understand the difference between like strategic ops and the most basic tasks in Salesforce, like just creating a text field.
I think a lot of sales leaders, and this is a broad generalization, but a lot of your traditional sales leaders come from Salesforce, Oracle, Cisco, these big companies that by the time the sales leader started were pretty mature operationally. So these people have often never seen the inner workings of an ops team. All they've seen is the output of operations. So they receive the new list of territories every quarter or every year or whatever, and often have never been behind the scenes or part of the decision-making process. This is especially true in startups. I've worked for people who are brilliant sales tacticians and strategists who have never actually seen how the sausage is made, and they end up way in over their head. And it's often tempting to think like, oh, well, I've worked at a big company that has this figured out, therefore I have it figured out. And often that's not the case.
Got it. Yeah. So it's like a timing thing, I guess. a little bit, timing and experience. The other, like, you know,
Hmm.
ideally you have an expert leader who understands everything, but actually if you think about it, it's not necessarily their job to understand it, but they should at least like trust, right? So they should be open to
Yeah,
pushback and questions.
100%. DocSend did this well. It's part of the reason I was so excited to work with these guys is they brought in a VP of operations and strategy very early, which is good for
Mm.
two reasons. One is in my day job, I'm not just doing ops. Um, and second is they brought in somebody they trusted who had a lot of experience in operations, and they handed them the reins operationally and do what the executive team should do, which is ask questions in plain English that the ops team is then supposed to go find the answer to. Um, and it works really well that way. And yeah. Anyway, I'm rambling at this point, but that is a common mistake that companies make, which is I think what Michael's speaking to.
Yeah.
Not having that resource internally, and sales leaders are often just sort of up the creek without a paddle. They don't have that resource. They don't know what they don't know, and they end up floundering.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So one last question about account territories, and then and account selection, and then we're gonna hop on to another topic. And guys, great questions in the chat. Keep them coming. They're all in my pocket. We're gonna get to them. So this one's from Alex. I'm gonna try your last name, Alex Araujo. Sorry. Um, so beyond creating and sharing an ICP and a general go-to-market strategy, how do you hold reps accountable and guide them to select their own accounts within those kind of top-down decided strategies and approaches? Like operationally, how can you keep them within the guardrails?
So this is something that I talk to clients about a lot, which is you have to do more than just like point them to the big pool and say like those are the ones you're allowed to go after. So one thing that your operations team should be doing is figuring out like, hey, what do we expect from these reps in terms of output, and work backwards, do the math backwards. So if you say like, look, we think an account executive or an SDR can make 50 cold calls a day and send 50 one-off personalized emails, then you need to work backwards and say, well, the math says that means, we can, that allows us with, the waterfall of activities that happen as you add people to your outreach or sales loft sequences. You work backwards and figure out that, like that means we need to add, I don't know, 200 contacts or 400 contacts per month.
Mm,
And once you work backwards through the math, then you figure out, well, we're reaching out to on average 10 people per company. That's what we figured out leads to success. That's our best number of contacts per company. And so we should each be going after 40 companies per month. Well, once you know that, once you actually understand your outbound funnel, then you can start really narrowing down the strategy and say, okay, well, there are 1,000 accounts we could go after, but with our 4 reps, we need 160 a month. So how should we arrange those? And then that leads to more questions that ultimately can guide you to a better strategy. So when you're telling a rep, pick 40 companies this month, that's much better than pointing them to 1,000 accounts and saying, go get it.
mm,
Then you're saying prioritize the top 40. Well, what makes, now that you have a small percentage of that big pool that you can go after, you're choosing 4% a month instead of like figuring out what of the 100% you can, I guess, spray and pray. Then it gets to a place where you're probably prioritizing more intelligently, and then it depends on a bunch of different factors. How big are your clients? What's the deal size? You may figure out that actually our deal size is so small, we actually need to do a really heavily automated outbound motion. Or, you know what, we only really need a couple new opportunities a month. Let's do a really narrowly focused small group every month and do highly personalized outreach.
yeah. And that's like the math that goes into that can be like your lifetime value, average cost of acquisition, what's your average contract value at start, um, you know, so there's some math to be done. And maybe like, so to try to boil down the really good detail you just give, what I'm taking away is like, narrow the guardrails. Like instead
Mhm.
of giving somebody, yeah, go pick your accounts, this is the general strategy, give them a little bit more detail.
Yeah, give them more detail. And, at some point, it gets hard to be super prescriptive when we're just talking about the whole world of potential strategies out there. But
Right.
doing the math is a first step toward getting more focused. And really, anything that focuses you more is probably a good thing. Um, and, there are exceptions to everything. But generally speaking, like, find ways to focus.
Got it. Okay, makes sense. And great question, Alex. Thank you. Sorry for butchering your name. We have another, this is like, I think one of the best questions I've seen on a webinar from, where'd your name go? Maria. Maria's question is, as sales executives, what are the questions we should be asking our ops team?
Oh, gosh, that's a great question. What are the questions you should be asking your ops team?
Like, I know like one of the things we talked about is, I think people think of ops as like data gophers sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
or like, get me this field, get me this report. When a good ops person and an experienced ops person can actually like take the burden of problem solving off your plate to some extent. So instead of asking you for a specific outcome you think you want, you can give them what you want to achieve with that, and they can help you maybe craft a different solution that's better or more scalable or will work for the long term or can be used across the whole team. But I know
Yeah.
that's like a general. That's not like that's not like what should I ask. That's like a here's something to think about.
Yeah, that is a great question. It's a really hard one to answer. I think the first thing that the sales team and sales executives should be asking is like, what are areas for improvement we haven't seen yet,
Mm,
especially if you've got a talented ops team. If you have a skilled ops team with a lot of experience, one thing you should constantly be asking them is like, what are the areas for improvement that you see? Set aside my, you know, the things I personally want. What are areas of focus that you think we're missing? Another is you should always be asking like, hey, what patterns are you seeing? What are you seeing in terms of where we're winning, where we're losing? Are you seeing things change in the background? For example, are you seeing that there are any new industries relative to last year that we're starting to break into or achieve critical mass in that we should be thinking about? But ultimately, it's really hard to know what you should ask the ops team. It's a great question, but it's a tough one. Yeah, I'll have to think about that. I'll come back to it if anything else pops into my mind. But yeah, I agree. Great question.
yeah. As you were describing, I mean, those are all good things to ask, but I also feel like, Maria, you're off to a good start by even asking that question. Like, it shows you're being somewhat thoughtful. And my guess is that if you have that kind of thoughtfulness about, am I using this team or resource the best that I can, you're, there's not necessarily a straightforward answer to how to do it right. But if you're being thoughtful about it, that's probably the right approach. Um, we've got a couple really good questions about SDR comp, quota, incentives.
Oh yeah.
I'm going to try to boil in here. So, folks, we're going to switch topics. I've got everybody else's questions, don't worry. But Kevin, geez, hard last names, guys. I'm usually pretty good. I'm going to try. Okay. Kevin Forozesh, sorry, asks, what's the best recipe for SDR quota? It seems like quota attainment is different across all startups. What format offers the best incentives while still focusing on booking quality meetings? So the things that he has seen are total demos sourced only,
Mhm,
total opportunities only,
mhm.
or business or AE closes from demos you source as a sweetener.
This is a great question. This is a really deep pool to swim in. So I'm gonna start with zoom out. Before you start talking about how you should pay your reps, you should ask, what does this team hope to achieve?
Yep.
Because you should start by reading the Bridge Group's annual report. They talk about this stuff constantly, and one of the things that Trish asks over and over, and she's absolutely right, is what is your team trying to do? What's their goal? And think strategically. And the spectrum is meetings versus highly qualified opportunities. If you're looking for just setting meetings and you're just like throwing them over the fence, And for some companies, that is the right strategy. It's not necessarily that there's a right or wrong, but where you land on the spectrum is going to inform the answer to this question. So one thing I like to think about here is your SDRs are usually a junior team. They're usually new to sales. And so one thing I like to do is pay them for the inputs. Not totally, not only for the inputs, but I like to have an element of hedging against a bad month, week, whatever, especially with relatively new sales development teams, because often the company is experimenting with the whole idea of sales development. So man, pay these people for doing what you ask. So one of the things I like to do is, so let me back up. One thing I don't like to do, and this will transition into what I do like to do. I don't like bounties for sales development. Unless you're a mature, big sales org that has a very clear understanding of what an SDR can and should bring every month, quarter, whatever, and it's not going to change. Unless that's the case, stay away from bounties. Here's why.
And by bounties, you mean like paying someone to get
Yes.
an account done and in?
Thank you. So a dollar amount per X thing, meeting, new pipeline opportunity, whatever. The problem with bounties is it's psychological. It's not actually mathematical. Mathematically, it's a semantical difference between that and what I like to do, but psychologically, it's a huge difference. So if I say SDRs, you get $200 per meeting, and I expect, 6 meetings a month, that's $1,200. And then we figure out a couple months down the line that actually we're really trucking. I think we should actually be able to get 12 meetings per month for the average SDR. Now I'm going to go back to them and say, hey, guess what, guys? Now you get $100 a meeting. You owe 12. That happens all the time, doubling quota or increasing quota. And I did the doubling for easy math, but imagine it was a 30% increase or a 50% increase. That happens all the time. And it's necessary for a growing sales development team to be able to shift goals to accommodate, team growth and hitting your stride and things like that. When you have a bounty, you're absolutely putting yourself in a terrible position because your SDRs are going to start quitting because they're going to say, you cut my pay in half. What I like to do is to have a percentage to goal number and weight that percentage based on 1, 2, or sometimes 3 elements. So at DocSend, which is all inbound, but the logic is the same here. There is meetings set, or meetings held rather, meetings held, dials, and connects. Those are the 3 things because those are the things we care about, and that's why they're part of the comp. So we took the 3 things we care about, we mixed them in, and if I remember correctly, it's like 60%, 20%, 20%. 60% meetings held, 20% dials, 20% connects. That covers the things we care about, and we have a number goal for each, and people are paid according to their total attainment of that goal once it's weighted. And that way, over time, I've slowly increased these numbers, and some months I might even need to decrease them to account for seasonality or a new rep or something. It's very easy to shift when you have this weighted percentage versus a bounty. But the real trick is figuring out what the elements of that percentage should be and how they should be weighted. And that is informed totally by your strategy.
Interesting. Okay, so then there was another question that kind of tacks onto that from John Gomez. Thanks, John. Which was kind of asking about across different industries, how does that change? So that's what works for you guys at DocSend. It may not necessarily be what you would prescribe to somebody you work with at Iceberg RevOps, but you've peered into and under the hood of a lot of different places. What are the variations you see in that? What works well in different places?
So a lot of companies want to tie SDRs to pipeline. I'm ambivalent about this. Sometimes there are very rare occasions when I think it's a good idea. For example, when you have a pod set up where the fate of the SDR and his or her individually matched AE are tightly linked. Outside of that, I like holding SDRs accountable to things that they can control. Tito the other day wrote something on, and if you guys don't know Tito, he's the founder of Alti Sales. They're an outsourced SDR company. So this guy is super passionate about SDR everything, and he's really smart. And he perfectly demonstrated why you shouldn't hold your SDRs accountable to things that that they can't control. And he talked about showing up to a demo. He didn't name the company. He didn't call anybody out, but he said he showed up to a demo. The AE was unprepared. 3 questions in, he was like, you know what, everybody leave. We're shutting this down. We're not interested. Because the AE was asking, what does your company do? And
Yeah,
you know,
with the
things that they
CEO on the phone, like,
yeah.
yeah,
And
can't do that.
so, yeah, absolutely. And the reason this is such a big deal and the reason this ties into SDR comp is, imagine if that SDR is tied to revenue or pipeline even. That deal never made it into pipeline, and that SDR may have done a spectacular job. And frankly, I think they probably did, because they got Tito and his
I got
executive team
Tito
on
on
the
the phone.
call.
Yeah,
Oh my God, you've got the CEO on the call. This SDR probably crushed it. And if they're tied to anything other than what they directly control, they just got screwed. So your best SDR is really getting burned by this AE who sounds like they're not very strong. And so that's one reason I think you should really be careful about tying your SDR to anything down funnel. And guess what, guys? Everybody can point up funnel and blame people. It's why sales is constantly blaming marketing for sending shitty leads, and CS is always pointing to sales and saying they oversold. That's why this person churned, and sometimes that may be true, but at the end of the day, if you're up funnel, you really don't have a good way to defend yourself, right? Unless you
yeah.
have a spectacular ops team that can help you with it. And so yeah, I think you should decide what are they able to control, and of those things that they're able to control, what are the things we want from them, and then build a comp plan around that.
I don't think Zoom allows emojis, but I think if it did, we'd have a bunch of like the prayer hands and like raised hands emojis. Kathy Rabita saying yes, Taft. John Gomez is basically like, you know, he identifies with it. They're tied to pipeline currently, and you know, if the AEs aren't hitting their quotas, it hurts the BDRs. So everybody
So
kind of hears what you're laying down right now.
here's another big problem with pipeline is at some point the sales team's going to have a bad quarter, bad month, bad quarter, bad year, bad whatever. And there is one defense that every sales team can have, which
Yeah,
is, hey, we have a high win rate. So if we miss our goal, it's that we don't have enough pipeline, right? That's simple logic, and it's really hard to argue with. So if your sales team has any ability to decide if there's 1 ounce of subjectivity in what is considered pipeline, then guess what? You just gave the sales team control over the denominator of their critical metric, right? You just let them decide. You let them choose their win rate. And so marketing and sales development are going to suffer anytime you hold them accountable to pipeline. So I'm a big, and I know we're straying out of sales dev here, but account executives should be held accountable to pipeline. Sales development and marketing should be held accountable to getting that interest in the hands of account executives. And I'm a big proponent of, and have never been able to win this battle at companies, but I think it's coming. Companies need to build a nurture team. Companies need to start building teams whose only job is to bridge that gap from initial interest to pipeline. Account executives suck at it. SDRs aren't particularly good at it, because then you're asking them to do 2 jobs at once, nurture long-term these companies that have some level of interest and get more people in the door constantly. And over time, that nurture bucket fills up. It's harder and harder to pay attention to getting new people into it. So I love the idea of segmenting the funnel 1 small step more and having a very small team of like senior SDRs whose only job it is to nurture people.
that's a cool idea. So basically, those would be people who like aren't purchase ready now, but kind of like may have the need at some point in the next year and fit the ICP in every other way.
Yeah, absolutely. So great fit, bad timing. Those people need to be somewhere, and there are a lot of smart people who would disagree and say like, hey, that's the SDR's job, that it's their job to get them to the finish line, or maybe that's the AE's job once a meeting is set to stay in the pocket with them, and even if it takes a year or more. But neither team's incentives is well aligned with that goal, and
Yeah.
it is maybe the most important goal out there, because how many times have you guys seen great companies that just aren't ready just kind of fall away? It's a black hole. Yeah, John
Peter out.
Gomez
Yeah.
just said that, black hole. And So I really like the idea of making that a specialty. And frankly, at most small companies, if you have less than a few hundred employees, a medium-sized sales team, that could be 1 or 2 people. Their only job is staying on top of this bucket of, say, 100 or 200 companies. And every time there's an event, you're on the phone with everyone who lives anywhere near that city, and you're getting comped on getting them to the event, getting them to dinners, getting them to engage in some meaningful way until they're ready to enter pipeline.
I love that. I think you might have convinced a few people because Nemia is asking how you would compensate that nurture SDR role. Nemia is like, oh, I'm going to do that. How should I pay him?
So early on, you're going to have a long ramp because it's going to take time to fill that bucket. But I think you comp them the way you do an SDR, but this person can be comped on pipeline, right? This person, their job is to get it to pipeline. And a small team, you could actually allow this person to control what is pipeline, right? And you could take it a step further if you really wanted to and tie them to win rate. I think there's a lot to work out here, and it depends on your strategy, but I love the idea of actually having this person own the one number that nobody seems to have figured out, which is meeting to pipeline.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so we've got a couple other questions that it's a good transition, guys. Scott asked about automation and programmatic stuff. If you don't mind, everybody, we're going to pivot. So we talked a little bit about counts. We talked a little bit about like SDR structure and comp and role and incentives. One of the other common mistakes, Taft, that you brought up to me when we were talking earlier was like the do or do not automate question. Some people under automate, some people over automate. And I think they're like, again, as usual, no necessarily hard and fast rules for everything, but you had a couple like quick hit, these are common mistakes I see in the fixes. Can we run through some of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So getting more tactical here. One mistake I see happening all the time that's easy to solve for is pushing data that doesn't look natural in an email into merge fields in your outreach, your sales loft, your engagement platform. I actually like creating natural versions. So company name natural, first name natural, whatever things you're constantly pushing into merge fields. I like having a natural version that a human needs to type to translate, sales hacker, comma, LLC period into sales hacker. Yep. It is a really quick and easy way to ensure that you're not pushing weird data into an email. And imagine if you received an email that had, hey, Colin, I'm, some sentence that's just about you that, oh my God, they spent a lot of time researching. And then the next sentence has sales hacker, comma, LLC period in it. Your eye's going to go straight to that. And there's a good chance you're just deleting it.
Yeah. In all caps too, probably, right? Like,
yeah, this happens. So that's an easy one. It's just being careful about what data you're merging in. The more automated you go, the more you need to build in these guardrails to make sure that you're not sending like silly looking emails.
I know that one of the things I've done in the past on the sales hacker side is used a team of virtual assistants, like living, breathing, thinking human beings to help us with the data cleaning. We do automate some of it, but nothing beats a pair of hands for the weird stuff that I can't account for. Is that something you see people doing? Is that like a popular thing, or am I behind the times here?
No, I think you're spot on. So Ryan Reiser is sort of spearheading the making sure good data is being pushed into your CRM and your automation, with he's doing a lot of interesting work on like validating data before it hits your CRM and making sure you don't make these mistakes. Another thing we did a few years ago, I ran sales development and sales operations for a company called Smart Recruiters, and we built a pretty big process to house all of this work. And essentially, my goal was to up level the SDR function. So SDRs do 3 things: they choose the next account to go after, they approve the data that's been researched by other people, and they get on the phone. And so in order to do that, you have to take all the other things an SDR does and sort of pack it into this process, which was sending essentially the account to a team in India to be enriched according to some very specific rules about like which titles need to be added and and what data is going to be sent to the CRM. And then we had a US team that did two things. They wrote some sentence about the person and some sentence about the company, or sometimes they created like multiple sentences that the SDR could choose from that demonstrate that the person has been researched. And then you drop those in fields in Salesforce, they're automatically merged into emails and they go out. So the SDR's job is just to approve it all. So I love the idea of operationalizing that,
Yeah.
but ultimately it depends on your strategy. That's great for higher volume. If it's low volume, you probably don't need to do that. I think it's okay to have the SDRs manually do some of this stuff if your goal is to go after 20 new companies a month.
Yeah. And by the way, okay, so speaking of like cost of acquisition and average contract values, there were a couple questions earlier about like, how many calls do I need to make to set 4 appointments, and like anything like that where you're looking at funnel math. You gotta have a few numbers. You want, if you can, know lifetime value, but you should at least know average contract value at time of signature. And you should try to have some kind of number, like work with your ops person or your manager or whoever is going to help you get this math at a cost of acquisition number. And then there are conversion metrics all the way from like marketing qualified lead or whatever, however you've built your own funnel out. Every step has a percentage that gets narrower and narrower, right, till you get to ACV. You want the number after the sale to be bigger than the number before the sale by like a fair margin. So if you're wondering about like how many calls you need to make, there's like reverse math, you can do that. And those are the numbers to start with, just to address a bunch of questions all at once.
So Colin, I don't know if you're familiar with this. Do you remember that at Iceberg, we built a program for answering these exact questions specifically for outbound teams?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's called OB Metrics. We're not even selling it yet. We have some beta users, and if anybody wants to try it out, let me know. I'll happily help you get on it. But basically, it's solving this problem, which is everyone is blind to this funnel because you essentially have two funnels. You have an activity funnel, which is number of calls and emails that lead to a meeting, and then number of meetings that lead to a pipeline. And on the other side, you have how many companies and people you approach, because those are two different things, right? And there's a lot of algebra going on here because one company, the SDRs could make 1,000 calls a month. And in that case, maybe they're only targeting 3 companies, right? You could easily spend 1,000 calls on targeting 3 companies, and a higher volume team could, in 1,000 calls, target 500 companies. You know, I'm being a little silly here. These are ends of the spectrum, but you get the idea that like asking how many calls should we make depends on way more numbers than that. Just like you said, there's a funnel. And so what we did was we tied together the data from 4 objects in Salesforce. So FYI, you have to be using Salesforce for this to be helpful, and you have to be prospecting from the account and contact objects. Otherwise, it won't work for you. But if that's the case for you, it ties together data from activities, accounts, contacts, and opportunities into this 5th record that we created. That's the outbound, I can't remember what we called it, outbound something object. And basically it pulls in all this data on an attempt to go after a company and gives you answers like, hey, on average, how many calls do we make in order to set a meeting? On average, how many contacts do we drop into our funnel in order to, when we're successful versus when we're not? And so it answers a lot of these questions that are blind spots for teams. So like Colin said, without this funnel, like you're asking a question that only gives you 10% of the answer. How many calls should we make is way too zoomed in. There's too much more you need to ask. Zoom out and start with like, hey, how many companies should we go after to hit our number? Like that's the first thing you should ask.
You know what? I take it for granted because I spend a lot of time at Sales Hacker thinking about this kind of stuff. Like, how many people who visit the website actually subscribe? How many people who subscribe actually join a webinar? Do I get to like talk to them? How long do they stay subscribed? Like I've got my math because I'm, I don't know, obsessive like that. But I kind of take it for granted and forget that I guess not everybody does. So this is a great tool. By the way, everybody, I threw a link to Taft's LinkedIn page. Sorry, Taft, they get blown up, but message Taft if you want to check out OB Metrics.
Hey, and if you connect with me, tell me how you know me, because otherwise I just skip them, because I get a lot of these and never know if it's somebody trying to sell or actually trying to connect. So feel free to connect with me. Just write that, you know, you were in the webinar or something to give me a little context.
There you go. So we've got a really good question from Milovan. Milovan, I messed up your name earlier. I'm sorry. The question is like, what's a way of moving people from a price-based SDR approach to an experience-based approach? So like value focused, or focusing on the differentiator versus like, you know, we cost this much, here are the features.
Got it. So we're talking skill set for SDRs. Like, how do you move somebody to selling on value? Am I understanding that question correctly?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple things wrapped in there too. It's like selling on value, but maybe also selling to the customer's experience. Like, I don't know if it's personalization or just relevance to their pain point, but you've seen a lot of companies do this transition and kind of make this change. It's a hard change to make. What are the tipping points?
So one thing that a lot of startups struggle with, and why this is such a common question, I think, is because so many startups are run by product people who are their own sales teams early on. You start with founder selling. Founders often have success with founder selling because they get automatic credibility, because they're the man or woman who built the product that they're selling. And so they sort of get away with feature vomit, right? They get away with showing up and doing like the 6-year-old with Pokemon cards. It's like, look what this one does, and look what this one does, and look what this one does. And people make the connections on behalf of the salesperson because the salesperson is the founder. And then SDRs get in there and they don't get that instant credibility, and they're not given that leeway. And suddenly they just hit a brick wall where they do exactly what they've been taught. And everybody's like, why do I give a shit about your product? And they can't answer that question. So invest in training. With SDRs, either that may mean getting an SDR manager who is skilled at this to come in and train the team. It may mean hiring a trainer or putting them through some sort of training. Every SDR on my team has been through 2 different trainings. And I like both for different reasons, but I really like Winning by Design. I think a lot of people here have probably heard of those guys. Dan Smith is sort of their head of training, and he is a brilliant trainer and somebody who you should all look up and go connect with and like bomb his inbox and don't tell him why let's just make him wonder why he's getting a million of these. But Dan
I'm
Smith,
put his LinkedIn profile in the chat, guys.
Yeah, please do. So every SDR should go through this. So this teaches you and your SDR team how to think from the point of view of the buyer, how to empathize with the buyer's journey and think about where they are in their journey. Another thing that I actually like putting people through is Sandler training. It's kind of old school and it can feel a little stodgy, but those principles have been working for 40, 50 years now. And a recent study that Salesforce did showed that one of the things that is a good determinant of sales rep success is completion of Sandler training, which takes a year, is like a big commitment, but there is no training methodology I like better, but there are plenty of smart people who would argue and say there's another one you should use. It's really more about getting a methodology in the hands of your sales reps. There is no like quick tip or quick trick that's gonna transition a rep from feature vomit and price selling to value selling. That's something that takes time and training and experience, and you gotta invest in it.
Yeah. If you don't have money for it, tell them to subscribe to Sales Hacker.
There you go.
It's a start. It's a start. It's not going to replace a formal training program for sure, but yeah, it's something. All right. Again, everybody, great questions. Keep them coming if you have them. Taft, what other like common mistakes do you see in all the houses you walk into? What are the messes that everybody has?
Here's a big one. This is true of inbound or outbound SDRs. That you essentially lose track of your prospects. And there are 2 ways. I'm going to start with inbound because it's the easier one to conceptualize. Marketing throws leads over the fence, and marketing throws leads over the fence, and sales development follows up with them, but a lot of the time operationally you lack insight into whether all of them have been followed up with. Some of you guys may have experienced this, but you a month later get the question from marketing like, hey, we sent you 400 leads last month, what's the status of all of them? And sometimes that's a really hard question to answer. And so the next one you see is for outbound, which is, hey, how many companies did you approach last month? Which in and of itself is a hard thing to answer for a lot of companies, but they'll say, oh, we approached 50 companies, and how many contacts? Well, we reached out to 200 contacts, and what happened to them? I don't know, not sure. And so what a lot of companies will do is they'll build these like complex, often because you get a sales ops person, often like a Salesforce admin who's really excited about like building the scaffolding to hold all the data necessary to track it. And so they'll build, timestamp fields and date stamps and checkboxes and automation to like track all of this stuff. And it ends up being a jumbled mess. And then a month later, nobody can build one report to say like, hey, how many of these people did we actually talk to?
Yeah.
So the way I like to do this, it's so simple, but it works really well, is just rely on your statuses. Have one field that governs the status of lead and contact. And this sounds so simple. To people who have already figured this out, they're going like, yeah, of course. But you would not believe how many times at Iceberg we go into a company and figure out like, oh, you're not using statuses correctly. Part of this is making a single app or point of control for your statuses. Another one we see all the time is SDR follows up with or reaches out to a person, and then a few days later, the status auto changes and nobody knows why. And then you figure out that like, well, Jonathan, who worked here 2 years ago, changed it. What the hell? And it turns out they're the integration user for some other app that's changing statuses based on some old rules. So the first thing I do is say like, let's make sure nothing but Outreach or nothing but SalesLoft or nothing but HubSpot or whatever can touch this field. Humans and this one app can control the field. The one exception I make there is a lean data or ring lead or something that's actually routing the leads to like reset them to new as soon as they are assigned to an SDR. And just by doing that, you can have so much more success following up with and keeping on top of the statuses and what the hell's going on in your lead follow-up or your contact outreach.
You know what, the devil's in the details, and this is exactly the kind of stuff that people don't get excited about doing. Like another thing you talked to me about was having a data model, and like it doesn't necessarily have to be a big project, but this is something I need to have at Sales Hacker and don't have. And but like talking to you made me double, like I'm gonna do it because I can see how doing the simple boring stuff, the devil in the details stuff, could get me to a whole new level of success and just accuracy with our messaging.
And another one, and stop me if I'm going to run us over here, but
you're good.
Another one we deal with all the time is meetings. SDRs, you've probably dealt with this. Like, how many of you, by a show of hands, I'm kidding, we can't see you. How many of you have dealt with the issue where at the end of the month, you're like, I know I set more meetings than this. Fine, I'll go to the spreadsheet I keep on the side. I have my own Google spreadsheet where I type in the meetings and the status because I don't trust our CRM to actually track it accurately.
Yeah.
And so that's another thing that is such a simple problem to solve. You just need to build a process, map it out, put it in place, and this is the single place we track all meetings. And this is one of the first things we put in for like every client at Iceberg. So what we'll do is go in and say like, hey, in order to convert this lead, or once a lead is converted, in order to do anything with the opportunity, the account executive needs to input a little bit of information. And it's just like a few fields. It's not all that hard. The hard part is actually conceptualizing and mapping out what should happen when and what changes should be made by whom. But once you map this thing out, I'll send you, Colin, and if you want to send it out to people, I'll send you a sample. There's like this won't work for everyone, but it might help people conceptualize how to think about this. A map of like, it's a more complex one, but when people use events to track meetings, like I'll send you the flow we build for people. And it's like a button. Make it super simple. The AE clicks a button to disposition this meeting. And then they go through a flow and they have to answer a few questions. And once they're done, the meeting is dispositioned. They don't ever have to mess with it again. And yeah, I see people saying they want to see the map. So I'll send
We'll
it to
get
you,
it to
Colin.
everybody. Yeah, we'll
And
get it out.
yeah, so what we do is we build this process and we build a dashboard that gives you insights into all this stuff. And so what you end up with is a dashboard that says, how many meetings did we set last month? Who set which meetings? And then like maybe one of the circle diagrams that shows the pie chart of like, what are the dispositions of those meetings? Keep it simple. Accepted, rejected, no-show, and pending. Done. That's all you need. And of course you can dig in deeper and you can get more fancy, but like, God, don't start fancy. Everyone wants to start so fancy. Just like boil it down, keep it simple, and have those 4 statuses. And then it's easy to say, well, let's have a report that shows when meeting is pending and meeting date is in the past. That's one of your exceptions reports. Like, hey, AE, what the hell? The date's in the past, but it's still pending. Like, you messed up, go fix it.
Happen or not, yeah.
Yeah, so that's another one that a common mistake that ends up just costing SDRs so much trouble. And VPs of sales struggle with this too, because they want to know, like, what the hell's going on? Why do we not have enough meetings? I don't even know how many were set.
Taft, I think you need to put together a course, my friend, because we have just touched the surface of the iceberg, so to speak.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, but there's a lot of takeaways here. What I think I'm going to do for people, and I've never done this before, but I'm going to try it. So we'll send out your map. Everybody has the link to your LinkedIn, so they can ask you about OB metrics and iceberg if they need your help. I might also just clean up. Taft and I have some notes, and it doesn't include everything we talked about, but it has basically like an outline of some of the takeaways that we knew we might want to cover and give you guys today. I think I'm going to package that up nice for y'all and send it out, because there's a couple things we didn't discuss. John told me he was taking notes, which is smart, but maybe maybe you missed something, John. Maybe this will help you out. So we'll send this to everybody. We've got 3 minutes, and I'm going to do one more question just for John Gomez. So and then we'll sign off and leave everybody to enjoy the rest of your week. So John asks, what differences do you see in sales orgs between companies with short buying cycles and long buying cycles? And like, how does the structure change?
Oh man. Okay. Short buying cycles, we see with more transactional sales, way more focus on super tight operations and automation. I'm assuming short cycles correlates with high volume. If not,
Yep.
then there's a pretty good chance you're going to run out of money. And then with companies with longer cycles, what we see is more of a focus on operationalizing nurture, which is like the big problem everybody's trying to solve right now and nobody's figured out. And you've got your 6 senses and Engagos and companies that are helping with the concept of a marketing qualified account, which is, I think, the way the world is moving. And we're going to see a lot more developing in that space. If you guys aren't familiar with these two, go check them out. Turn your sales leadership onto them, because they're, if you sell long deal cycle, big deals, that's probably something you should start thinking about having in your stack. And if you don't have an ops team, like, find a professional to help you kind of work it into your process. And that's the biggest thing I'm seeing, is like what they're operationalizing, sort of low friction versus nurture, which is usually the last thing that companies haven't gotten right in big deal cycles.
One thing I've heard is a difference kind of in passing, and I'm curious about your input on, is the SDR to AE ratio for like a low ACV versus a high ACV. Does that necessarily change, or does that depend on other things?
I think too many companies that are low ACV have SDRs when they shouldn't.
Mm.
I think there are too many companies that are injecting SDRs unnecessarily into cycles, when you could probably better operationalize the things that SDRs are doing, like email follow-up and lead quality determination, things like that. And then, but I mean, if you're 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 or even 1-to-3 in a super down market sale, like, one of two things is true. Either A, you're gonna, and I see, what do you call low ACV? I don't know. That's a great question. I would say my like imaginary line that I'm not super confident in, but it's the one I use in conversation, is below 50K. 50K is sort of the minimum for when I think outbound SDRs like should be something you consider. There are exceptions, I'm sure, but generally speaking, that's my like off the cuff number. So below 50K ACV, like DocSend, we're at like below 10K ACV. So we're like volume all day long. And and I want to cut SDRs down to the smallest number possible. And then I see like at Smart Recruiters, we were in the 100 to 200 K ACV, and in the SME, the small medium enterprise and true enterprise. And there we were 1-to-1 almost across the board, and it made sense. It paid for itself. It all boils down to the math. Like if you're not doing the math, if you're just sort of guessing, then there's a good chance you're gonna burn more money than you realize on the way to probably not enough revenue.
And there it is. I think that's the theme of the day, is like, do your homework, do the math, everybody. A lot of these questions, there's no silver bullet. You got to sit down and look at your funnel, look at your costs, look at your team, look at what's working and what's not, and do some homework. But if you need help doing that, Taft's your guy. So hit him up on LinkedIn. And yeah, we'll have to come you back. We'll have to bring you back to talk about the operationalizing nurture idea, because people loved the sound of that. So anyway, thanks for this talk. You're a font of knowledge and experience, and it's always a pleasure talking. Taft Love, thanks for being here, man.
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks everybody for stopping by. I'll see you on another webinar soon.